One of my favorite things about doing this YouTube series is it gives me an excuse and an opportunity to dive into albums, artists, genres that I probably don't give enough attention to. So let's dive in to 10 of the funkiest albums in my collection on this episode of Talking About Records. My name is G.I. Sanders from NTX Vinyl, a small chain of independent record shops in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. If you're not local but you are in the U.S., you can shop online at ntxvinyl.com, and would love it if you'd subscribe to our channel here on YouTube and follow us across social media, Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. Let's talk about some of the funkiest records in my collection. This was tough. With a lot of these, I could have chosen just about any album from the particular artist's discography, but I really tried to dive in and grab the absolute funkiest, or at least in my opinion, some of these are not only some of the funkiest, but my favorite albums from these discographies. So the wall behind me is mostly rock. Like, this is my rock wall. That's all things, alternative, classic rock, punk, metal, whatever it may be. Off camera, I've got an entirely different calyx, which is my collection of R&B, soul, funk. I've also got jazz kind of separated out. So I don't have near as many of these types of albums, but I do have a pretty good collection, and most of it's really curated and just my favorites. I don't have a lot of filler, right? So most of what you see here is an example of the rest of my R&B, soul, funk collection. But in this one particular, I wanted to dive into funk. So if I'm thinking funk, I'm starting one place. And again, I could have pulled a number of albums from this artist, but I had to go with Mothership Connection as the first on this list. I couldn't get past it. I really cherish this album. It has been one that gets a ton of rotation in my house. My kids absolutely love it. My wife doesn't like it too much just because it's so repetitive, but I love it. You've got, Wants to Get Funked Up. You got the title track, Handcuffs, Give Up the Funk. It's just, George Clinton to me, so creative, one of a kind, really. I can't really think of anyone else who creates an entire world for each of his records. Really unique and about as funky as it gets, in my opinion. When I think funk, I immediately think Parliament Funkadelic. I immediately think George Clinton. One of my favorites. A really deep discography. The early stuff. This is the fourth record from Parliament, and came out in 1975. Features the horn section from James Brown and the JBs, which is really, really cool. Obviously features the great Bootsy Collins on bass. And again, just I think it is the epitome of a funk album. That, and it comes with such a cool concept about African Americans going to space, which back in the day was not anything that George Clinton ever thought would be possible. And he just puts it out there, the entire aesthetic. You can pull up some videos from this tour on YouTube, and they'll blow your mind what he was doing from a production standpoint, what he was attempting to pull off. You can only imagine what he could do these days with the technology and how far it's come. But again, for this album to drop in 1975, just really ahead of its time, in my opinion. And I think it reset everything from a funk perspective. And I was reading up reviews on this, and kind of when you go to Wikipedia, you can read where it says what the reception was from this album. And in a lot of ways, there are some of the reviews were talking about how this was almost a satire about funk at the time. So it's really interesting. It's a playful album, but it's hard hitting, and the grooves are endless. So if you don't know Mothership Connection, I would highly recommend it, and it is definitely one of the funkiest in my collection. So that's number one. It had to be. There was no questions around that one. Following that up, it was a no-brainer to go Bootsy Collins, because to me, Bootsy and what he does for George Clinton on an album like Mothership Connection, absolutely, he just makes the whole album. So I went with the Name is Bootsy Baby. This is Bootsy's, I believe, second album, solo record. I could be wrong about that, but produced by George Clinton, of course. This has got just a plethora of organ, fuzzed out wah guitar. Of course, you got Bootsy's signature bass style. Absolutely really cool album. You've got the title track, which was big. The Pinocchio Theory, Rubber Ducky. I even just love the song title. So creative. Munchies for Your Love, Can't Stay Away. The artwork, as with most Parliament Funkadelic George Clinton records, is really out there, creative across the board. You've got a really fuzzed out shot of Bootsy there, and you've got all of the kind of cartoonish art on the back as well as the cover. So this is a really great record too. It's kind of, in my mind, almost a follow-up. It comes out 2 years after Mothership Connection. But again, that whole period of that mid to late 70s funk and the vibe that these guys had going on is really, really cool to see and look back on. And there's a lot of history there. So the funnest thing about, and I think I mentioned this in the intro, the funnest thing about me doing these videos is I get to go read up on these albums and kind of rediscover them. So this whole era of George Clinton and Bootsy Collins is one that really fascinates me, and every time I dive in, this is probably going to send me off and spiral on that era for a while, which is totally fine because I love listening to these records. So had to mention George Clinton, had to mention Bootsy right off the beginning, because to me those are essential funk records, funk artists. Another that I would kind of put right along those lines is Stand by Sly and the Family Stone. This predates those. It's not, it's certainly got a funk element to it, but definitely R&B soul driven. Came out in 1969, released just before Woodstock, which, if you know anything about Woodstock, Sly and the Family Stone had an iconic performance at Woodstock, featuring a ton of tracks from this album. So you've got the title track, you've got Everyday People, you've got Gonna Take Me Higher. Let's see what else we have on here. Sex Machine, You Can Make It If You Try, Somebody's Watching You. So Sly is one of those artists, again, really unique, ahead of his time, and cross genres too. Like I mentioned, not only is this a funk record, it's an R&B, it's a soul record. He's got plenty of stuff, this record as well as others in his discography. There's a lot of great guitar hooks and stuff. So it's just a great album through and through. One of those classic artists from the late 60s, early 70s, which really does stand the test of time, in my opinion. So if you're not familiar with his discography, this is a pretty good place to start, in my opinion. I think again, several albums from that era are fantastic, but this is kind of one of the more funky ones, which is why I called it out for this video. So love Sly. I could go back and watch that performance at Woodstock where he performs a lot of this stuff over and over, and I have. It's fantastic and one of the standouts from that festival for sure. So all right, next up, this is a little bit of an odd one, but again, as I was going through my collection, it stood out to me. And it's interesting because it's a compilation album. This is Grant Green and his album Breakbeats. This is a Blue Note release from 1998, I believe. And it's a compilation. I think it's about 7 or 8 tracks, so it's not extensive. And what they did was they took his funkiest songs from his previous discography, which is extensive, and they compiled them on this 98 release. So most of Grant Green that I own and that I know of is more straightforward jazz guitar, which I absolutely love. And of course, he's all over these songs on guitar, but it brings in a funk element that that I really appreciate and really caught my ear. When I found this album, I wasn't real familiar with it, and then I saw it came out in 1998. I'm like, well, when was it originally released? Well, it wasn't, because again, it's a compilation that didn't come out until '98 that references a lot of his previous work. But the songs in this are sampled by tons of hip hop producers, artists like Public Enemy, Us Three, a ton of great hooks and beats that that are repurposed in later recordings. But it's just an interesting one, again, because like everything else I have in my Grant Green collection is for the most part jazz guitar driven, and this brings in those funky elements. And I don't have the albums that these tracks are pulled from. I don't have a lot of them, just because some of this stuff's hard to find on vinyl for sure. So, but I love Grant Green. I thought this was a really cool album and was super excited to come across it. And I remember when I first dropped the needle on it, I was kind of blown away, just because I didn't know Grant Green got that funky, but he certainly does. And this album really proves it. It's a hard one to chase down on vinyl, unfortunately, because again, it was just reissued in '98. I don't think it's had any other reissue, but it is really cool, and I love the artwork on it as well. So there you go, Grant Green, Break Beats. Next on the list, from 1972, this album featured the first #1 single from the great Billy Preston. Obviously, was a pretty prolific solo artist and musician in his own right, and then got a huge boost to his career when the Beatles brought him in on the Let It Be sessions, and I think propelled his solo career in a lot of ways. This features the Brothers Johnson, which is incredible, and the big hit Will It Go Round in Circles. It doesn't get any funkier than that. This guy on the organs, I love actually the back with him surrounded by all of his organs and pianos. Really well respected musician, and I think underrated in a lot of ways, underappreciated. I've got probably 3 or 4 of his albums, this one being probably my favorite, called Music Is My Life. I don't know if I mentioned, yeah, it came out in 1972, but just a really, really solid record. It's not all funk laden. Really, I chose it just for Will It Go Round in Circles as the key track, but it's also got, his cover of Blackbird by Lennon McCartney, mostly other solo stuff. Let's see. Yeah, mostly everything written by him on here. A couple co-writes, but a really, really solid record that honestly I don't see that often too, is another reason I picked it out. And that's kind of how I've become to appreciate a lot of these types of albums, is I just don't see them that often, at least not down here in Texas. I think maybe if you went up north more, maybe to the Detroit area, or like, the East Coast, maybe you'd see more of these R&B soul funk albums out in the wild in collections, but I just don't see that many of them down here. It's far and few between. So when something like this comes along, I usually gravitate towards it, and I've come to really appreciate it over time. So definitely great records, definitely got some funk on it. So check out Billy Preston's Music Is My Life. Next on the list, aside from George Clinton, Parliament Funkadelic, Bootsy Collins, the second artist I thought of was the Meters. One of my absolute favorites. I'm a huge fan of everything the Meters have done, and the history and the vibe they bring with their New Orleans style of funk. This is their debut album, self-titled. Sissy Strut is the big instrumental song off this one. That is a huge song for them. It's got the sophisticated Sissy as well as the Sissy Strut, produced by the great Alan Toussaint out of New Orleans, of course, and featuring Art Neville, sorry. And this one's another one that's been sampled a ton. So Tribe Called Quest, Two Live Crew, NWA, all kinds of kind of more contemporary hip hop artists have sampled not only this album and the Sissy Strut, but tons of Meter songs. I absolutely love the vibe. Like I said, I'm a huge fan of the style of the New Orleans funk, jazz, soul from the late 60s, early 70s. This came out in 69, and I could have picked one. I think I've probably got 7 or 8 Meters albums in my collection. Fire on the Bayou is another favorite one. And I almost had that one in here, but I switched it out for the self-titled. But love the Meters. Their stuff's pretty hard to come by as far as originals are concerned, but there's a lot of nice reissues. This is a Music on Vinyl reissue because I've never even seen an original copy of this one. I could probably chase it down, but they command a pretty good price because there just weren't a ton of them pressed, would be my gut, and a lot of them haven't survived. So if you can track down any albums by the Meters, I would highly recommend it. This is a good one to start with. A lot of instrumental tracks on this. In fact, probably mostly instrumental if I remember correctly, but they do work in some vocals on some of their preceding albums after this one. So love the Meters, love New Orleans funk. Next up, Jimmy McGriff, Electric Funk. This is a really cool record. Another one on Blue Note, similar to the Grant Green break beats. Sorry, I can't speak. This is kind of like a soul jazz funk combo. A really smooth record. Another one that I have not seen a lot. Was excited to come across this one. This is culled from performances from 1969. Obviously, you got Jimmy McGriff on electric organ. You've got the great Blue Mitchell on trumpet. And the coolest part about this entire album is the interplay between those two, between the organ and the horns. It is just really top notch, and I really appreciate the performances. I love the Blue Note label, of course. Let me see some of the tracks on this one. Got Jimmy McGriff on the back there. You got Back on Track, Crisscross, the Birdwave, Spear for Moondogs, Part 1 and 2, Funky Junk by Horace Ott is the last track. So just a really cool. This is a 97 reissue. Again, same time period as that Grant Green came out. And another one that's kind of tough to track down, but I highly recommend it. If anything, go look it up on YouTube or stream it because it's a fantastic album. Super funky, super smooth. Can't recommend it enough. All right, if you're going to talk funk, Parliament, Funkadelic, George Clinton, Bootsy Collins, come on. You got to have some James Brown on the list. I don't have an extensive James Brown collection because there are at least 50, 75 albums that you could pull from. Get Up Off of That Thing is an absolute epic funk song. This is an album, I looked it up, it's his 43rd studio album. It's unbelievable. It came out in 1976. Obviously features the title track, Get Up Off That Thing, Release the Pressure, You Took My Heart, I Refuse to Lose, Can't Take It With You, Home Again, In This Feeling. This is an original pressing from 76. Arranged and produced by James Brown, and then the credit is James Brown, Minister of New Super Heavy Funk. Great record. Again, you can't really go into funk unless you're gonna pull a James Brown record out. So I had a few that I was considering, but I love the cover on this one. I love the cartoonish cover in the crowd, and I love that title track. So I had to pull this one out. Much respect for James Brown and everything he created and how much ground he broke, in the late 50s, even going all the way through the 60s and 70s. Such an expansive discography, an expansive career, and consisted of a one-of-a-kind artist. I don't think there has ever been another artist like James Brown to do the things he did in the studio, on the stage. Absolutely groundbreaking. So love Get Up Off of That Thing. Super fun album. Let's see. Probably the most obscure album in this list would be Tighten Up by Archie Bell and the Drells. If you've never heard this album, and specifically the title song here, super fun. This came out in 1968. It's a band based out of Houston, Texas, believe it or not, Archie Bell and the Drells. Super funky. Tighten Up is just a jam. They've got a couple albums. This is the only album I have of their early days because it's really hard to find their stuff. They're not particularly valuable necessarily, just rare in that you don't see them. There's a a public radio station here in Dallas called 91.7 KXT, which is the KERA station. And they played this song. This is going back many years. And I heard it and I was like, I'd never heard this song before. Had to track it down and didn't realize they were based out of Texas. It's an interesting story. Archie Bell, they recorded this album and then he got shipped off to Vietnam and kind of stalled the band's trajectory because this album was starting to actually get some traction on radio. Or sorry, this song Tighten Up was getting some traction on radio. So by the time he came back from Vietnam, and they resumed, so they lost a little bit of momentum, I think, which is why maybe a lot of people, maybe you haven't heard of them or heard of this record, but really good quality funk, soul, jazz, R&B, highly recommended. This is my favorite of theirs. I do like all the early records. There's, I think, 3 or 4 early records, and then they went in and got into kind of a disco phase even and progressed through the late 70s. But super fun album, amazing song. Again, another one that's frequently played in the house and with my kids. Love Tighten Up. Definitely go stream it or find a copy of this one. Last but not least is The Greatness of Innervisions by Stevie Wonder. It's hard to put this one last on any list. It could be first when you've got songs like Higher Ground, when you've got songs like Living for the City. It's just fantastic. Stevie played almost every instrument on this album, which is incredible. Came out in 1973. This is his 16th record. Something I did know, which was interesting to read about, is that 3 days after the release of this album, he was in a near fatal car crash. I just read about this on Wikipedia as I was kind of researching the record, and it said that he was traveling. He wasn't driving. He was sitting shotgun with someone who was taking him, I think, after a show, and a logging truck slammed on the brakes, and a log actually went through the windshield and hit Stevie in the forehead and knocked him unconscious, and he was in the hospital, and it took him a long time to recover from that. I didn't know that. Incredible story in regards to this album and the timing of it. But as I look back through Stevie's career and the early to mid 70s albums that he put out, this is one that is definitely a high point for me, Innervisions, and definitely brings the funk with Stevie on that organ. So love Stevie and love this record, and again, another one where I could have picked several of his to fit this list, but I think because of Higher Ground, it just it had to make it. So there you go. There are 10 of the funkiest albums in my collection. As always, would love some recommendations. What are the funkiest records in your collection? What am I missing? Certainly there's a ton. This is just the tip of the iceberg, but these are some that stood out to me. As always, this has been Talking About Records. My name is G.I. Sanders. Really appreciate you guys tuning in, and we'll see you again next time.